Why do some people have great strength but small muscles, while certain fitness influencers lift relatively light weights yet have exaggerated muscle size? Is there really a correlation between muscle size and strength? With more research emerging on hypertrophy, people are gradually realizing that natural muscle building methods seem increasingly similar to powerlifting, involving heavy weights, long rest intervals, and so on. This has led many to worry about whether such training might result in strength gains without muscle growth. Experienced gym goers might be familiar with two professional terms: myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. The earlier belief was that bodybuilders primarily developed sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. The sarcoplasm refers to the liquid and nutrient contents within muscle cells, mainly water, glycogen, and other nutrients. Since these are non-contractile components, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy leads to increased muscle size without proportional strength gains. Based on this understanding, early bodybuilders often used moderate weights, high volume, and shorter rest intervals in their training. In contrast, powerlifters pursued myofibrillar hypertrophy, as the myofibrils are responsible for generating muscle strength. Their training typically involved heavy weights and long rest intervals. This misconception partly stemmed from early comparative experiments. A 2015 study in the UK compared the contractile properties of the vastus lateralis muscle in 12 bodybuilders, 6 strength athletes, and 14 untrained individuals. The strength athletes included rugby players and weightlifters, both of which engage in explosive power training. According to the bodybuilders' logs, their training involved primarily 8 to 15 RM weights. The study found that the bodybuilder's specific tension per fiber was 62% lower than that of strength athletes and even 41% lower than untrained individuals. Simply put, for the same muscle volume, bodybuilders had the lowest strength. Researchers inferred indirectly that the bodybuilder's hypertrophy was predominantly sarcoplasmic. Similarly, a 2008 Japanese study compared the triceps of elite bodybuilders and national-level weightlifters. It found that while bodybuilders had larger triceps cross-sectional areas, their strength output per unit area was lower than that of powerlifters, echoing the conclusions of the earlier study. Another piece of evidence came from a Canadian study in 2010, which compared leg extension training using 90% 1 RM heavy weights versus 30% 1 RM light weights. Participants performed 4 sets, with the lightweight group averaging 24 repetitions per set, and the heavyweight group averaging 5 repetitions. After 24 hours, the lightweight group exhibited more sarcoplasmic growth. Based on these findings, early theories concluded that bodybuilders should use moderate weights and short rest intervals to maximize sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, while strength athletes should rely on heavy weights and long rest intervals to achieve myofibrillar hypertrophy. However, there's a twist. These studies had notable limitations. Both involved highly experienced competitive bodybuilders. In fact, the UK study explicitly noted that 9 out of the 12 bodybuilders admitted to using anabolic steroids. This is critical because steroids independently promote sarcoplasmic hypertrophy regardless of training. Many users report rapid weight gain when taking steroids, far beyond what can be explained by myofibrillar hypertrophy. When they stop, their weight drops just as quickly, likely due to changes in intracellular water content. Another limitation was the short time frame of these studies, which only compared muscle fiber properties at specific time points. Many factors influence strength, including neural efficiency. Some of these bodybuilders might have had weaker baseline strength before training, highlighting the role of genetic predisposition. Bodybuilding focuses on aesthetics, such as proportions and muscle definition, while some sports, like weightlifting or sprinting, place a premium on natural talent. Lastly, the 2010 study measured hypertrophy effects only 24 hours post-training. Temporary sarcoplasmic hypertrophy may not translate to long-term muscle growth. In fact, this same study found that by the 4th hour after training, the 90% weight group exhibited a higher rate of protein synthesis. Higher quality long-term studies now suggest that the rep range doesn't affect the type of muscle fiber growth. For example, comparisons between 3 sets of 3 RM, heavy weights, and 3 sets of 12 to 18 RM, lighter weights, showed no difference in sarcoplasmic changes over the long term. These studies also indicate that training methods don't alter the specific tension per unit area of muscle fibers. In short, for an individual, larger muscles generally mean greater strength. Muscles are compared against themselves, not others. However, strength gains aren't solely dependent on muscle size, as other factors, such as neural efficiency, technique, and tendon strength, also play significant roles. To summarize, for natural athletes, both heavy and light weights ultimately lead to the same muscle growth mechanism, myofibrillar hypertrophy. Only steroid users are more likely to exhibit exaggerated sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. As for those influencers with massive muscles but relatively low strength, they may lack a genetic predisposition for strength or rely on enhancements. A common misconception in muscle building training is that after several months or years of working out, many people start to feel tired, bored, or even resistant to training. This is often due to central nervous system, CNS, fatigue. CNS fatigue can also lead to decreased athletic performance and slower reaction times. Some believe that this is caused by lifting heavy weights too frequently, but in fact, high repetition training with lighter weights can cause even more persistent fatigue for the nervous system. Let's explore the science behind this topic. What is CNS fatigue? Our muscles are able to perform movements because they receive electrical signals from the central nervous system, including the brain and spinal cord. CNS fatigue refers to a reduction in these signals, which essentially means the muscles can no longer generate the same amount of force. Researchers can quantify CNS fatigue by observing the activation levels of muscles. If activation decreases, it indicates some level of fatigue. Another way to infer CNS fatigue is through its effects on untrained muscles. For instance, if frequent training with the left hand leads to CNS fatigue, the strength of the right hand might also decrease, indirectly reflecting CNS fatigue. Comparing heavy and light weights. Now let's delve into scientific studies. 2 studies have found that in seated single-leg knee extension exercises, training with 40% of maximum load caused more fatigue than training with 80% of maximum load. The lower weight group exhibited greater decreases in muscle activation and strength. Another study showed that training to failure with just 20% of maximum load resulted in reduced muscle activation for nearly 13 minutes, while 80% maximum load training only caused fatigue lasting 30 seconds. Therefore, when warming up with light weights, avoid training to failure. Another study on the dorsal interosseous muscle in the hand found that sustained isometric contractions at 30% low intensity caused more CNS fatigue than contractions at 45, 60%, or 75% intensity. However, these studies measured fatigue immediately after training. What happens over a longer recovery period? Long-term fatigue recovery. When comparing light and heavy weights over an extended recovery period, lightweight training led to slower recovery. In one study on seated knee extensions, participants using 30% of maximum load recovered more slowly than those using 80%. Similarly, training with 40% load not only slowed recovery, but also reduced the strength of the untrained leg for up to 72 hours after training. This is because CNS fatigue is systemic, meaning it can lower the strength of muscles that weren't directly trained. By contrast, 80% heavyweight training did not decrease the strength of the untrained leg, indicating that lighter weights with higher repetitions place a greater overall stress on the CNS. What about compound movements? Deadlifts are often considered one of the most fatiguing exercises, but there are no direct studies comparing deadlifts with isolated movements due to the complexity of muscles involved in the deadlift. However, one study provides some insight. Researchers recruited men with an average of 7 years of training experience to perform deadlifts, squats, and bench presses over 3 weeks, 1 exercise per week, at 80% maximum load, 4 sets per session. Muscle swelling, joint mobility, and delayed onset muscle soreness were measured. The results showed similar muscle responses across all 3 exercises. While this study didn't measure CNS fatigue specifically, it challenges the assumption that deadlifts are inherently more fatiguing for the CNS compared to other compound movements. The impact of training to failure. Training to failure or near failure also leads to more CNS fatigue. If you notice a drop in your lifting performance over time or feel resistant to going to the gym, it might be time to adjust your training plan. Consider reducing high repetition, low weight sets or lowering your training volume. Ultimately, the key to achieving your fitness goals is consistency. Only a sustainable training plan can lead to long-term success. This concludes our discussion on CNS fatigue. I hope you found this information helpful.